Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. I am very happy to have with us former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, an American veteran. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks. Good to be with you. Thanks.
You know, it's been a very, very hard, sad week. As of the moment we are taping this, it appears that the suspect was caught and is in custody. We certainly hope that is the case, and we hope that there's no one else involved in this. I want to focus on the way the president has handled this. Let's be clear. No one is condoning political violence. To the contrary, every person across the political spectrum who has spoken to this has condemned this. But Donald Trump didn't simply condemn political violence. He did something else. And I'm curious what your reaction to that was.
Yeah, I mean, look, the president's basically made it clear when it's violence against the right, he's upset, he's angry, and he'll do justice. And he's actually used, and I can't come up with the exact words, but even more kind of chilling than that. If it's against the left, he's kind of speechless. You know, I don't remember him making a lot of statements about the murder in Minnesota. And we could go on and on. And look, I mean, here's the thing. In the 60s, there was a lot of political violence, right? But you had leaders ultimately that recognized they needed to do their best to bring the temperatures down. Nobody wins in violence. I mean, even if, you know, some on the right have this view that they're better armed than the left, so somehow they would come out of this better, they wouldn't, right? Nobody wins. And now, though, the difference between now and the 60s is that we don't have political leadership trying to calm the waters. Not to mention, we also have social media in that. So the president has kind of implied that it's okay to have violence against the left. He's not too concerned with that. Violence against the right is a different thing. Look, I've, like you said, I've not seen a single political leader condone any of this violence. Now, I've seen people on the internet condone it. I've seen people on the internet condone what happened to Paul Pelosi. I saw Trump Jr. joking about what happened to Paul Pelosi. Look, violence is wrong. If you believe in democracy, you believe that we've built a system to dispense of violence by instead turning that into arguments. We debate fiercely. And this shows that democracy is failing, and it shows that we have a president that doesn't honestly care if democracy is failing. I think he truly has compassion for Charlie Kirk and his family, but when it comes to violence on the left, you know, after 30 years of programming some people that the left is not human or the left is the enemy, it's not overly surprising that you would see somebody not necessarily upset if there is violence against the left.
And I think that's where you see this imbalance. Democrats do condemn violence on both sides, but in the current incarnation, the Republican Party does not. And they either see this as grist for more vengeance against the left or this feeling of victimization. But you can't get past this contrast between the rhetoric concerning Minnesota, when someone like Senator Lee was making wild statements and accusations for which he never apologized, and the reaction here.
Well, and Carrie, let's talk too about,
please,
let's not forget January 6th.
Yes.
One of the most violent days in this country, right? January 6th, a condoned attack against the U.S. Capitol. We are lucky that only a handful of people lost their lives in that. It could have been 100, right? I lived it, one of the most violent days. And not only was that not condemned by this president, he pardoned everybody that got held responsible for that. So look, again, all of us should say that all political violence is wrong, but let's not pretend for a second that it's exclusive to one side. It is a cancer in America, not a cancer in one political philosophy.
And let's not also pretend that politicians all behave the same way. Democrats behave in a fundamentally different way than Republicans. very few voices did you hear. Tom Tillis, I think, was the one who stood out, who said, you know, what the president's doing is not helping matters. And good for him. Unfortunately, they only seem to speak out once they have decided to retire from
Sure.
public life.
Always the case.
I want to shift gears just a bit, drawing on your military background, but also your background as a lawmaker and your status as an American. What is your sense about the way the president is deploying the National Guard and using them? I'm not even sure what they're actually doing. He sent them to Washington, D.C., but they're picking up trash and patrolling, you know, the Washington Monument. What is your view about that? And what's the danger to the military in using them in that fashion?
Yeah, so first off, DC obviously is a unique area where the president actually has
Right.
control of the National Guard. Here's an important point to mention. One of the things the president always argued on January 6th was that he wanted to deploy 10,000 guardsmen, but Nancy Pelosi wouldn't let him, or the mayor wouldn't let him. So this is proof positive that we've been saying that's not Nancy Pelosi or the mayor that has control of the DC Guard. It's the president. He can do as he likes with that. And that's in this case. And I think, look, it's a waste, first off. I think it's damaging to the civilian military relationship because people begin to see the military not as the men and women filling the sandbags or the men and women fighting Al Qaeda on their behalf. They start to see them as oppressors in the street. That's not beneficial. It becomes the military then becomes a partisan instrument, which is, I think, it's the last, frankly, institution anywhere in government that shares bipartisan support. So that's dangerous, and I think that's being done intentionally, by the way, to tear that apart. But the other thing is, it's making us numb to what could be future deployments. Now, let's go to LA for a second. The fact that the US Marines were dispatched there were only sent there as a chilling effect because they're Marines, right? The National Guard was federalized, which means since the governor didn't agree to their deployment in California, they had to go on what's called Title 10 under presidential authority, which means they had no law enforcement capability. They had no law enforcement authority. They were basically the equivalent of the 82nd Airborne. But all of this is doing one thing. It's making us numb to this idea of troops on the street. And I think the president is going to do everything he can to implement more troops on the street when he can. Obviously, Chicago's pushback as of today has made it appear that that has made a Chicago intervention less likely, though it could still happen. And so that's a lesson to governors, by the way, to continue to fight back against that. But the bigger point is this. The president will say accurately, and this is accurate, when we deploy the National Guard, crime goes down. And it does, right? Because if there's a guardsman nearby, probably there will not be crime in that vicinity. I also read the book 1984 a number of times. Thought was even a crime in 1984, and they had plenty of people out there to enforce that, and it was a pretty crime-free fictional country. If you put a troop in basically every square meter of this country, there will be no crime. There's not a lot of crime in North Korea, right? There's not a ton of crime right now in China because everything is monitored. The question is, do we want to live like that? Do we want to live where there's troops everywhere on the street oppressing us because of crime? The truth is, Jen, and you know this better than anybody, every dictator comes to power on the back of the message of crime. Not a single one has done otherwise. Look at El Salvador, look at what's going on here, and any dictator in the world, they came in on the issue of crime, and that's what's happening.
Absolutely. Philippines is another prime example of that. Um, when you talk about desensitizing people, I also think of the way in which he is deploying ICE. Again, he has the legal authority to deploy ICE. We question, and they have repeatedly been held by courts to be acting in ways that are not constitutional, although the Supreme Court just lifted a stay. Or is that also having the effect of desensitizing us to the violent apprehension of not hardened criminals, but working potentially, and I say potentially, undocumented immigrants? And what does that do to kind of the fabric of society when we need those people in those communities to be able to interact with law enforcement, to report crime, to cooperate with authorities?
Well, it's destroying the reputation of ICE. You know, up until this point, ICE, probably controversial, but most people recognize that they would do their job in removing, criminals and people that lawfully needed removal. What they've turned ICE into is almost like feels like the brown shirts, right?
Yes.
A
Yes.
personal like, police force of Kristi Noem and Donald Trump who wear masks, who don't identify themselves or show a badge. Here's what I've always wondered, Jen. Like, I'm always armed wherever I go because of threats against me. If guys jump out and try to pull me out of a car and they're masked, am I to just assume they're law enforcement? What if they aren't? What if they're actually coming to kidnap me? Like, that's a real question, and it's going to lead to violence. And for this to be upheld, to say, I don't know if the Supreme Court's upheld this, but to say like you don't have to identify yourself is so anti-American to me. And by the way, for those that say, well, these guys are going to be doxxed. Okay, we shouldn't dox law enforcement. Let's be clear about that. But it's also not new. Anybody that goes into law enforcement knows that they have to show their face in public. That is a danger of the job. Just like going into the military, there's a danger that you could get shot by the enemy. The reality is that's the job you take. And while nobody should dox law enforcement, we cannot use this idea of doxing as a straw man to allow people to obscure their identity simply so that they can act. I will say extra constitutionally because they have their mask and name obscured.
Exactly. And of course, the whole concept behind local law enforcement is that they're a member of the community, that people know them and they know the people. So it's completely counterintuitive. I want to end with one other incident that happened recently, and that is what, frankly, constitutional scholars, former Pentagon officials are calling a murder on the high seas. There was a fishing vessel. Apparently, we suspected it was involved in some kind of drug trafficking. We don't know. There was no effort to interdict, and there is now reporting that it was turning around, and yet we blew it up and killed people. Is this the military that you were trained to serve in?
No, it's not. And anybody that knows my foreign policy knows I'm pretty hawkish, right? And pretty lean forward on some of this stuff. But this is a different story. Because we have let's say this was a boat that was running bombs to somewhere, to Miami, and we didn't have the ability to interdict it. Then I think that is an imminent threat. A strike against that is constitutional, legal, and understandable. We're now finding out this turned around. We haven't heard a lot from the military in terms of here is the positive ID. Why are there 11 people on a drug boat? Why would you need 11? Wouldn't you have one or two so you could put more drugs on there? And then also, we do have a way of interdicting these. It's done all the time. The Coast Guard interdicts them. They shoot out the engine of the boat to stall it, and then a Coast Guard vessel comes and interdicts. Well, I know now it's in international waters. Maybe you send a Navy ship to interdict, but you certainly can do this without blowing the boat up. Look, this is clear what this is. Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth, who are scared to death of Russia, who now are backing away from China, by the way. The recent national defense strategy had them backing away from China, who changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War so they can feel tough, did this as a show. They're picking on a country, and I don't love Venezuela at all, and I would love to see Maduro gone. But they're going after Venezuela specifically because it's not on our border and they can pick on Venezuela easily and put on a good show. That's what's going on here. And this is nothing but cosplay tough guy. And that's been Donald Trump's MO his whole life.
And in some bizarre way, perhaps they think this helps their effort to detain and then deport Venezuelans in his made-up war against a drug cartel. I would just add, of course, that he doesn't have the authority to change the Department of Defense. There's actually a law that created it, but in
It is a
Donald Trump's mind.
nickname. It's a
Yes,
nickname
it's a
now.
nickname. And gosh, that's really what we need to spend our time and money on is coming up with nicknames for dysfunctional departments of our government that are run by children.
Yep.
Adam, it is always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's always sad because I fear there are no Adam Kinzingers on the Republican side of the aisle left in Congress. And as much as we now need to make sure the Republicans are not in a majority, we can't live in a society in which every election hangs and the democracy hangs on one party prevailing because the other party is anti-democratic and authoritarian.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you so much, Adam. We'll look forward to talking to you next time.
You bet. Take care.